Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. I am here live in Wellington, New Zealand. I've got my couple of Genmaicha. I hope you're bringing whatever drink it is that you like to join me for this chat on great places to visit, great city, but could you live there? That's something that I've asked myself over the last, I don't know, quite a few years actually, when I've visited from place to place, even if it's just for a short while. Could I actually see myself being in this place? And I'd love to hear from you in the chat today. Places where you visited, where you thought you might be able to live and perhaps even work, even for just a little bit of time. And other places where you've thought, great place to visit, but definitely can't live here, even if working might work for you. I guess this is what I've done in the past, but it wasn't really called a digital nomad lifestyle then. Often I've kind of like quit a job, maybe had like a month or two where I've been kind of like traveling, but then I've also been doing a little bit of kind of consulting work on the side or getting ready for my new job and keeping in touch that way. And so even if some of that wasn't digital a lot of the time too. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about lots of countries and cities that I've visited, talking about it from my own personal experience. I mean, like there are problems in every city, in every country that you go to. But what I'm going to talk about is my impressions when I was there, what I liked, what the transport was like, what the weather was like, what the food was like, the people, and what I thought might be tricky and what might put me off from living or working in that place. So I'm going to just get this kind of like poll started. If you're interested in just kind of like jumping in on that anytime that you're here, hopefully that'll be there. And then let's just start a little bit of kind of like a chat here as well. Awesome. If you are in the chat, please give me a type and let me know who you are, what your interest in this is today. It's great to see you here. Oh, that's a bit too long for here. Let's try and get that sorted out. Ooh, good. That'll paste in there. And then let's get that one in there as well. Oh, nearly there. Just need to get rid of one more character here. And it's in. Awesome. All right. So let's start with it's 9:02. I'm in Wellington, and I'll tell you my story about how I came to be here in Wellington, where I arrived in 2006, a little bit later on in this story. Hey, Jim, how you doing? Oh, it's good to see you, man. I always like working with absolute minimum of commuting. I'll talk to you a bit about that. I'm lucky to live right now on the south coast of Wellington. To get into the city takes me about 20 minutes on my scooter, maybe 30 minutes on my bike, if I borrow my wife's bike, which is an e-bike, but we live in quite a hilly city and it's very windy as well. So sometimes you're pushing up a hill and the wind, which can be a bit of a problem. Traffic's not great in Wellington. Public transport's okay. It's mainly buses. Doesn't really have a subway. It's not really big enough. It's capital city, but there's only about 300,000 people in the whole region, let alone in the city itself. So yeah, it's not a big city. And Jim, you're in Oahu, I think. Sorry, Oahu. There's an Oahu in New Zealand. So yeah, interested to know how long your commute is at the moment. Let me start at the beginning, though. Let me talk about London. So I was born and grew up in London, and I left as soon as I could. The thing about London and growing up in London is that it's kind of big, and I couldn't really see myself having a future there. I wanted to go to university, but going to university in London would have been a bit of a bind. Would have meant living at home, which is kind of like not what I really wanted to do at that point. And also public transport wasn't as good as it is now. Would have taken a long time getting from the centre of London back again, and would also have been expensive too. So yeah, that drove me out of London to start off with. And I lived in a few different places, and I'll come back to one of those in a minute. But one of the things that I've always thought about London is that it's a great place to visit. I love going back and catching up with my friends and my family. But to live there again, I actually recently advised one of my friends who has moved back to the UK, and he was thinking about whether he should live in London or not, or live possibly in Cardiff or possibly in Edinburgh, which were the options to him for his job. I said, look, you're going to be going back to London anyway for work. You're going to be visiting quite a lot. I think that's a great relationship with London, to be visiting and working for short periods of time. To actually live in London, I think is actually quite hard. I think you end up spending a lot of time not only commuting, but also just the daily transactions of life. Just there are a lot of them, and they take quite a long time. And you can do it for short stints and periods of time. But actually, if you've got a family or setting up and living there, perhaps you're not ultra rich. You can't live in the center. You're commuting quite a long way, maybe from kind of like zone 5, zone 6 outside of London. It's going to take a lot of time, and that starts to add up and starts to wear you down. And theoretically, London's great. There's so many things to do, so many parks, so many green spaces, theaters, cinemas, restaurants, food, coffee, bars, cafes, clubs, whatever you can imagine. But you're tired a lot of the time from all of that commuting and everything else that you have to do. So yeah, London for me, great place to visit, not a great place to live. I ended up moving back to London 2000 to 2005 to do my clinical psychology training. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. If you didn't know that, kind of stopped doing that earlier this year. But fantastic place to get trained. But again, just really difficult to kind of live there. And so I moved in 2005 back out of London again. Let me just catch up with the chat here. I've thought about it like when we were in Vienna. Hey, Paul, how you doing? I'm catching up with Paul for a coffee in a little while. I really did wonder what it would be like to live somewhere and immerse myself in a place, learning its history and culture and using that to inspire my writing. Also, Vienna is very livable. Interesting, Paul. I have a different take on Vienna. Now, it was a long time ago when I went there, and there's a possibility that I might end up in Vienna. My wife works in a job where she might get posted in various different places, and that could include Vienna. It's a small possibility. It's a realistic possibility. I found it challenging, particularly at that time. For somebody who is brown, I found it quite challenging, particularly when I kind of like grew up in London, where being brown's not really doesn't signal like difference. There's lots of people who are brown. In Vienna, I stuck out as an oddity. So that was my impression and my perception. It's not somewhere where I would have felt particularly comfortable being, but I agree with you. Historically, culturally, really interesting place. Don't know whether it would be a good fit for me. Interesting that you say about livable. What do you mean by that? Is it the transport? Is it the cafe scene? What is it that you're thinking about there? Because from what I remember, the transport was fantastic. It was really good. Jim, born in the UK, moved to Oahu in the 1960s. My dad hated the drive to and from the urban Honolulu area. I got my dislike of commuting from him. LOL. Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time commuting in London. Kind of like the standard commute, I think, in London is an hour. If you're getting less than an hour, you're kind of getting away with it. That's pretty good. Hour and a half is probably what most people are doing. And that's just going to work. And then you have to do the same coming back, which is why I think there was like and still is such a massive resistance to going back to full-time office working in London, because people kind of got used to not having the commute every day, and then having the commute every day feels like such a massive chunk of time that you're losing again. And I think people kind of like were sleepwalking that, listening to podcasts, reading the paper, reading their books or whatever. But then once you kind of reset and then have to do that again, I think it's actually really difficult. So I think going overseas and seeing other people's lifestyles, it's also really interesting as well. How do they deal with it? I'll come back to Tokyo in a while, because that's like another level. I'll talk about that when I get around to it. Paul, my dad was the same. Jim, he had a 60, 70-minute commute back in the 60s. I saw how he hated it. Yeah, and I think I hated it, although it probably came out in different ways. Yeah, I think I hated it because it made me tired. So I wasn't particularly like upset about it, but it just kind of ate away at me and gnawed at me. And as soon as I could get rid of it, and I recognized it as a problem, I did. And so I moved to other places in the UK, in England and Wales. I'll come back to that. Jim, I adore London. Always loved visiting from my old stomping grounds in Thorpe Ness, Suffolk. But I mainly got around London on foot. Yuck, right? No, not at all. I when I go back to London now, particularly kind of like with, the hangover of the thing that's been with us over the last few years, I try not to go on the tube as much as possible. So, I love now getting off at Paddington when I'm back. And if I'm meeting friends at Lord's to go and watch Middlesex play, I'll walk through Little Venice and the canal area, which I'd never really walked through before. Before I thought, hey, do you know what? I don't really want to be in enclosed spaces. If I can avoid it, I'm going to walk this. And it only takes like 30 minutes, which isn't that much longer than if I'd gone on the underground and walked from St. John's Wood. If you know London at all, it's like, these are the places that you have to do to navigate to get to this cricket ground. It's wonderful. I love being above the ground. And the underground is great for getting you to places quickly if you've got a long place to go, a long distance to go. But I think London Transport, TfL, Transport for London now, is recognizing this, has done for a while. I want people to be on bikes and kind of selling that on the experience of being above ground and trying to get cycleways and stuff. It's still pretty dangerous for me. I've only been on one of those bikes a few times, but yeah, I love walking around London. So yeah, not yuck at all. Yeah, Paul. Yeah, you can see that why it might change opinions. Transport's awesome. Also, fantastic food. All the stuff I want to be immersed in was walkable. Yeah, another city where everything is much more walkable than you kind of like expect it to, which I visited, was Rome. Rome was like, it's got its own challenges again, but like again, really surprisingly walkable city. Not that surprising though, if you think about the history and all the stuff that's still there from ancient times, from 200 BC right through to kind of like 500 BC and beyond, AD and beyond. Then you see like how much of that is still there and how much of that is still walkable. I was really surprised when I went there. I've only been there once, at just how walkable things are. Jim, yes, that annoying feeling of sitting on a bus or sitting in a car can feel life just slipping from my fingers. Yes, walking is an active thing. Bicycling is an active thing, keeps my mind alive. Yeah, do you know what? I've never really done the long commute in a car or a bus. It's always been on a train. Yeah, that's another level of like commute that I would not be able to deal with. Sitting in a bus or a car for a long period of time. And it's been an active decision to stay away from Auckland in New Zealand because of that, because most of the time when you're trying to get from A to B, you're probably going to be in a car. The bus network is getting a little bit better, particularly if you're trying to get from like the north shore of the city, which is like beyond the kind of like the river on the other side of the Auckland Bridge down into the city. But no, Auckland I couldn't do, just because of like you would spend so much time in a car. Paul, yes, living in Nottingham, I come to St Pancras and walk to appointments wherever I could. We all develop our own relationships and routes through the city. And I think that's what's marvelous about it. We have our own familiarity. We know our own landmarks and we walk through the city in our own ways. I even have that relationship with Tokyo now. It's quite crazy. I know bits of the city now, the biggest metropolis on the planet, and I have my own things. And I have to be a little bit careful not to just stick to those routes all the time and to be adventurous and to go to different places, because there was so much there to explore. And I think that's one of the things that I kind of try to guard against, balancing that familiarity and newness when we're going to a new city and not getting too much into a groove. And it very much depends upon how I'm feeling on the day. Sometimes you kind of like, you need to do the action first and the feeling comes later. And I have to kind of like talk myself into that adventurous spirit of being. Sometimes you just want an easy day though, right? You just want the familiar. It's comforting. Jim, I briefly commuted by car in Los Angeles. Oh my God. Yes. Now, okay. So you're going to bring me on to my next place. Maybe I'm just going to round off the UK. So the next place I want to talk about, which I think is like a really, really underrated city in the UK, which I briefly mentioned earlier, was Cardiff. I love Cardiff to bits. Cardiff is the capital of Wales, which kind of shares a border with England in the UK. It's the bit as you're looking at the map, on the left that sticks out. Cardiff's right on the bottom. And it is a fantastic little capital city. Reminds me a lot of Wellington in many ways. And I just had a wonderful time there. I studied doing my PhD there, my research PhD, from, let's see, 1991 to about 1996. Had a wonderful experience there. Really small, compact city. I'd never really been there before, but my PhD supervisor invited me down there when I was an undergraduate to come and visit because he was keen for me to come as his student, and I was keen to explore and go to new places. And I'd heard a bit about Cardiff, but I'd never actually been there. But it was a wonderful, livable, walkable city. It's undergone a lot of kind of like regeneration, redevelopment with EU funding, which unfortunately the British have kind of kicked to the side now, having left the EU. So it'd be interesting to see what happens next. But yeah, wonderful, livable, walkable city, wonderful people. Really, really love the vibe. If you ever get the chance to visit the UK and you have some time, make the effort to go to South Wales, go to Cardiff. You won't regret it. It's a lovely, lovely city. Well worth a visit. Paul, yes. Suze was very clear when we came to New Zealand that we were not going to live in Auckland. Yeah, good advice from Suze. She steered you well there. Okay, so that's London and Cardiff. Cardiff was a little bit challenged, I guess, at that time by public transport. I think it's got a little better since then. But what I have done is I cycled a lot when I was in Cardiff. I lived on the other side of what's called Bute Park, which is right in the middle of the city behind the castle and across the River Taff, near the cricket ground and a place called Pontcanna. But I used to bike everywhere in Cardiff. It's a very, very bikeable city. So I did love doing that. Jim, I love a town near Cardiff. Worked in Barry. Barry, you used to go to Barry Island, did you? In Glamorgan for a time, a walker's paradise. Yeah, I used to love it down there. Yeah, I used to go visit Barry every now and again. If you have ever seen a TV series, Jim, I can recommend it to you, called Gavin and Stacey. It's a kind of like a long-term romance between Gavin, who's a Londoner, and Stacey, who lives in Barry Island. And it's the story, it's a kind of like a romantic comedy over kind of like a few seasons, a few series. Well worth a watch. I think you would really enjoy it given your history and where you've worked. You worked in Barry Docks. Awesome. So Jim, have you seen Gavin and Stacey? If you haven't, you really should. I'm sure Paul has. Okay, so next, let's talk about Canada. Places I've been in Canada, which I thought were awesome and great places to visit, but also places where I could see myself. And I came very close to one of them. Let's go back to 1985. This is a long, long time ago. And if you're watching this on replay, I'm not sure how many people are watching right now who would be alive at that time, but I have a suspicion that Jim and Paul were. Back in 1985, I'd just done what was called my O-levels. And I was feeling kind of like really kind of like hyperactive. I couldn't switch my brain off. And my mum and dad were kind of like, hey, you've worked really, really hard. We wouldn't normally do this, but your uncle has invited you to go and visit him in Toronto, and we'd be happy to spring you the fare, and you can pay us back when you kind of like come back for your summer job. And I was like, hey, sounds great, but I don't think I'll go because I want to see my friends. And then after a week, I regretted that decision, went back to my mum and dad and said, hey, can I take you back up on that? And 3 days later, I was on the plane. So the first time I traveled on my own, I was 16 years old. I do remember talking to the lady next to me on the plane, who was very nice. She was I think she was a medic, and she was on her way to a conference or something. So she tolerated my 16-year-old kind of like awkward conversation. And then ended up having a wonderful time for 3 weeks in Toronto, where my uncle kind of like basically said, hey, you're 16 years old. This is your base. We'd love to see you for dinner. Here's a Toronto Metro pass for the month. Go have fun. And literally just to kind of like let me go and explore. And it was a fantastic time. And I've always thought in the back of my mind, having gone to like, the Blue Jays games and, going up the CN Tower and just like experiencing the city. I think Toronto is a Native American word for meeting place. And you definitely got that vibe from Toronto. I definitely did as a 16-year-old. and could see, my cousins who are a bit younger than me were having a wonderful time there. And I could see, hey, look, maybe Canada, there's a reason why I've got so many relatives here. It must be kind of like an okay place to go. So yeah, it's always been in the back of my mind as Toronto as a possible place. The public transport system's wonderful, and as I say, I found it a really hospitable place culturally as well. Fantastic city with lots to do, lots of different restaurants and cafes, even back then. Uh, and so with that in the back of my mind, fast forward about 20 years, and then I was found myself in Vancouver, where again I had kind of like relatives, and this time my mum and my sister came with me. My dad came with me as well. Can't remember what he was doing, but he was around somewhere. Um, I do remember going with my mum on the ferry to Vancouver Island uh, and having, again a wonderful time. I found Vancouver just a wonderful city. Really, really enjoyed it. A really livable city. You've got kind of like Grouse Mountain. You've got skiing really, really close. You've got the whole of the harbour area as well. You've got some of my favourite authors live there. Douglas Copeland and William Gibson live there. And I've really, really enjoyed their books. And sometimes they set some of their stuff in recognizably kind of like Vancouver times. Really, really love the place. And the thing that stopped me from moving there, I think I just finished my clinical training and I was really interested in going to Vancouver and working there. But at that time, British Columbia would have made me sit extra exams around the legal system because I think psychologists there have kind of like legal powers, which I kind of like needed to get my head around. And I just finished a 3-year training course and I was not thinking about studying and doing a whole load of other exams. Kind of regret it a little bit sometimes, but then life can take you on many different paths if you give it enough time and if you're around long enough. So never say never. But I really, really saw myself in Vancouver and living a life there. I really, really loved it. I even went to the University of British Columbia campus and met some academics there, just kind of like scoping out whether it would be possible if a job came up in the future to go there. So yeah, I loved Vancouver. Don't know if anybody else has been there and experienced it and what you thought about it. It was a very, very livable city. Could see myself living there permanently, not just for like short periods of time, but permanently. It was a great place. Let me just catch up on the chat for a second. Yes, they showed that series even here in Hawaii. The mention of Barry gave me strong nostalgia, Jim. Yes. Paul, my mum and sister lived in Toronto in the 60s. The first people I ever knew who lived abroad, really. It was tempting. And Suze has a relationship with Vancouver. Yeah, Paul, Canada is New Zealand with scale. Yeah, interesting. I think interesting. A lot of scale. I don't know if you watched the recent travel series. I can't remember what it's called, like The Great Adventure or something like that, where people have to race across Canada, but they only have the amount of money that it takes to fly across Canada, but they have to do it by ground, and that's all the money that they have. And they have to find their own way. They have challenges to get to for each kind of like episode of the series. Really good. It's all UK people traveling in Canada, trying to make their way from, Vancouver all the way to the East Coast, like past St. John's, like in Newfoundland. So yeah, it's a interest. Jim, Toronto means meeting place. So there's Oahu. Neat. Yeah, it is neat. So yeah, if you've not seen that series, yeah, that brings strong Canada vibes, and you do see the kind of like Canada is New Zealand with scale, so much empty space that you kind of like come across, so many different landscapes, but also so much emptiness, so many places where there are no buses. You're just having to rely on hitchhiking to get from one place to another, and interesting rules around hitchhiking and where you can and can't do that, which were brought to life in that series. You can't hitchhike on the highway. You can only do it, and you can only ask for ride shares at kind of gas stations or other places like that. You can't just become out on the street doing that. So yeah, interesting. Kind of like everywhere has its own rules, but that was an interesting one to see. Okay, so that's Canada. Let's talk USA. So I was pretty late going to the USA. When I was in Canada, I went to Niagara Falls, never went across to Buffalo or the other side at all. When I was in Vancouver, though, I did go down to Seattle for a day trip. This was the time of Scooch Pooch Records. If you don't know Scooch Pooch Records, they were the original label that signed Nirvana. And they were kind of located in this kind of like divey underpass in Seattle. And I really, really wanted to go there. This was like kind of like, peak kind of grunge Nirvana days. And I really wanted to go. There was nothing really to see there, kind of like meandered around the record shop for a while. But it's interesting to see the people and the grunge culture in Seattle in those days. And then I always had I always had opportunities to travel when I was doing my work as associate professor in disaster mental health, which is I've left that behind a while ago now. But I had the opportunities to go to Seattle, and this is kind of like a psychology conference that I went to, and I went there for a week, and I loved it. I really, really liked Seattle. A big fan of Frasier, I have to say. I'm a big fan of Frasier. I'm actually quite liking the reboot. The writing's kind of like okay, but it's got really big nostalgia vibes for me at the moment. I have a really nice relationship with that show, and it kind of reminds me of Seattle. And that week in Seattle, I even ran an event, like a 7K kind of like community event when I was there, and that was fantastic. So yeah, I could see myself living and working in Seattle. I was not too far from the city center. There's a lot of rain there. I know that, but I've lived in New Plymouth in New Zealand. There's a lot of rain there as well. That kind of like northwestern, kind of like Pacific coast in the US gets a lot of rain. So does Vancouver and British Columbia, but Seattle gets a lot apparently. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. Could see myself being there, perhaps not forever. And I think that's the thing about the US is that I see the US as possibly, there are lots of kind of visa and administrative problems with working in the US, but I guess the whole thing about, kind of like guns being on the loose also kind of like worries me a little bit as well as the political atmosphere there at the moment. So yeah, don't mind visiting the US. I wonder whether I'd be able to live there for too long. I do think I'd quite like the lifestyle, but also things like, arranging healthcare and all that kind of like administrative stuff in life, I think would be quite difficult. But yeah, I'll come back to that maybe later on. Let's go back to the chat. My travel show for Canada was always due south. Great show. Loved it. Kind of lost touch with it. I think they stopped broadcasting, or I was moving from one place to another during the time. So I kind of lost touch with it, but I do know what you mean. And I do think that was a great show. I just got an advert for outdoor spas. They know your audience. Yeah, they probably do. Hey, like YouTube's pretty good. Like Google is kind of spooky. USA, no. I love my one trip to San Francisco, but can never live in the USA, and especially not now. I know there are better and worse places, but no. Yeah, I hear you. There are some really interesting things about being in the US, and I kind of like visiting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, I think I'm probably in your camp there as well. For me, administratively and politically, probably not a great fit. Could see myself there for short stints. So Los Angeles, let's go. I'm not going to talk about San Francisco because I just think that's a no for me. San Francisco, really, really interesting, just crazy prices, just not livable. I don't have a tech job. I'm never going to be working for Google or some kind of like crazy startup where I'm going to get like a nice share portfolio or whatever. I have been to San Francisco a couple of times, just crazy expensive. So I think that I'm not in that kind of industry. If you are, could be a great place for you. But even people who are in that industry in San Francisco are moving to places like, Dallas or Austin and places like that now, Houston even. I know that there are tech hubs growing in those places, or even here. I know that New Zealand's quite seriously trying to recruit people from those industries here. So Los Angeles always gets a bad rap. And Los Angeles is like one of the major hubs to get from New Zealand to Europe or anywhere else in the US. So I think later on this year, they're saying that post kind of like the thing, there's going to be 29 weekly flights between Auckland and Los Angeles because American Airlines are starting up, United have just started up, Delta have just started up, and New Zealand do it, and Qantas do it. And who else might enter the market? But I think I heard some Air New Zealand executives saying that's going to be a record. There's never been that many flights between Auckland and Los Angeles. So I think, travel between the US into New Zealand and New Zealand back into the US, I think there's a really interesting time that's starting to open up. And I actually have always loved, I know it's really stereotypical, but I love Santa Monica and the Venice kind of like area, and a little bit further down. If you go down to some of the beach like Hermosa and places like that, down the coast, I've always really, even down to Long Beach. Got some colleagues who I stayed with in Long Beach as well. Went to the aquarium there, really loved it. I could see myself living a local lifestyle if I was there for like a couple of weeks in places like Venice or Santa Monica. If I was kind of like just working a part-time digital nomad lifestyle, and I kind of like did a stopover on the way to Europe, if I had that kind of a life, I could see me doing that definitely. But in terms of actually getting around Los Angeles stuff, you need a car. Yeah, they have a bus system, but if you actually use the bus system like I have done, it's just kind of like the blue collar workers who are using it, who don't have any other option, or they don't really want to be spending like a ton on gas sitting in traffic. So yeah, it's a difficult place to get from A to B unless you're kind of like sitting around in cars, or you've got a lot of money and you get people driving you around as well. So yeah, it's difficult but interesting. I've always found it an interesting place. I remember the experience of arriving in Los Angeles and people kind of like coming up to me in the street, literally offering me jobs, number one, and number two, they always opened the conversation, no matter where you were, with "Don't I know you?" And I think I figured out after a few goes of being to Los Angeles that people were terrified of not remembering you and then missing an opportunity because it looked like they'd snubbed you. Because there are so many people working in kind of like the movie or the TV industry who are working in other jobs whilst they're kind of like making ends meet. They're always thinking that you might be the opportunity, you might be the connection. So constantly networking on the go. Even like when I first moved to New Zealand, I was staying in Los Angeles and it was Valentine's Day, and I thought it'd be fun. And I went speed dating in Los Angeles, telling people, look, I'm not actually interested in a relationship. I'm just interested in kind of like, making connections. But yeah, even then, going to bars after that night, people would start off with, "Don't I know you?" And they did, but then other people would, who I didn't know, would say the same line. So yeah, interesting place. Let's go back down here. Yeah, Jim, I'm loving this little conversation. Please join in if there's anybody else as well. But I'm loving this conversation. Paul, I kind of think the same about many parts of the USA too. Being out here in Hawaii, it's almost like being in a foreign country. Like all of you here, I've lived all over the globe. Yeah, I think I've never been to Hawaii, Jim. It's on my list. It's actually quite expensive to get there from here. I think Hawaiian Airlines had just stopped as well for some reason, probably financial, but they did have direct flights. I seem to remember something about that they're stopping now, but I'd love to come sometime. LA is a great place from which to live. Some kind of distant place is a dystopian nightmare. Yeah, it's yeah, I can see that too. It's so many different novels. I read, kind of stopped reading him now because I find him too disturbing. James Elroy. I don't know if you've ever read James Elroy and his kind of like, noir fiction of his detective stories. They're pretty grim and they're all set in LA, and it's enough to put you off the place, I tell you. San Francisco was nice. Stayed there in 1966. Yeah, I've been to Haight-Ashbury. I'm sure it was a very different place in 1966. Just visited a few times over the years. Expensive and filled with despair now, sadly. That is sad. Let's come to New York. I was late to New York as well. I didn't go to New York until the year 2000. That was the first time I went. And I was on a round the world trip trying to figure out where it was that I was going to work once I finished my clinical training. And I kind of landed on New Zealand. I'll talk about that when I come to that. But New York, I don't know. I don't know why I'd never been there. I think it was kind of expensive when I was kind of like growing up and in my like early 20s. I don't know if you remember, Paul, but there was always the fight between kind of like British Airways and Virgin, and they kind of like had a cartel, all the airlines before Virgin came along, and keeping the prices pretty high. When Virgin came along, they kind of knocked that on the head a bit, but prices didn't fall that much. So it was actually still really expensive to go transatlantic to the US from the UK. Canada was a little bit of a different story. So yeah, Jim, yeah, understandable, intriguing, disturbing, I would say there as well. Have you read his autobiography? That's his My Dark Places, I think it's called. Yeah, interesting book. Um, so yeah, going to New York from London was not an option when there were so many other places you could go to for me and my budget. But on a round the world ticket coming back, I decided to stop in New York, and boy, did I feel like I kind of missed out. I loved it. I thought it was great. I did have a first night in this kind of multi-bed dorm where I arrived at like 11 p.m. and I got the last bed and had to get there at night, and everybody snored and stank in that room. So it wasn't a great first experience. In fact, I think I spent most of the night in a pizza place just down the block because it was just so yuck in that room. So yeah, not a great start, but I did love it. I was quite disturbed when I first went on the subway, and I think there was a quite a heavy rainstorm, and all this water started falling in down the roof. So yeah, that was disturbing. I'd never seen that before in the London Underground, so that was weird. But then I realized actually the New York subway is not actually that far underground compared to like the London tube tunnels. So yeah, that was interesting. But yeah, even just going to like the museum and the Metropolitan Museum and MoMA, places like that, just culturally different. I went to the Getty in LA, and I went to kind of like the La Brea Tar Pits as well. So there's really interesting things to do in LA, but like very different culturally, very different kind of like for a city life. Um, it looked like the films, and the people were like in the films and on TV, and I kind of loved it. I thought it was going to disappoint me, but it didn't. Now there's all the downside and the dark side of that as well, that comes along with that. And I think growing up, Harlem and New York City being kind of like bust constantly, like struggling for money and struggling with crime, and I grew up with kind of like um, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and the kind of like all that hip hop talking about life in New York and how grim it was. And then, there was kind of like another movement that talked about that, and it developed in the UK. So, that was kind of like the picture that I had in my mind as well of New York, which is kind of off-putting, but also kind of intriguing too. So yeah, I've been a few times now. I remember going for a TED thing there as well, with one of my colleagues as well. And that was really interesting to be there for kind of like in a work kind of like mode in New York. And I could see myself being in New York for a work mode for a short period of time. Again, don't know if I could like live there long term. Kind of like Williamsburg and Brooklyn as well. I had some friends and I went to visit them and stayed there for a while. Loved that. And going to Coney Island and watching like a minor league baseball game there, and all of that kind of like American stuff. It was great. 4th of July fireworks and everything. It was fantastic. Loved it. Yeah, so that's the USA. Let's move along the globe. I'm not going to skip out quite a lot of kind of like I've not really visited or been or stayed any period of time in the Middle East. Kind of like occasionally transited planes there. Not going to talk about India because that's a no for me straight away because of the pollution, but also the political climate right now. So I'm going to skip that right now. And then let me just catch up with the chat before I go in. Jim, never been to New York City. Flew over it, looked out the window though. First came to the USA through NYC. Was a tot though. What's a tot? I'm not sure I understand. Paul, interrupted by let's call our car. Oh no, man. Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, I saw you writing about that. Your car was stolen. Good to see you. Yep, I'll see you again soon. For coffee soon. Catch you soon, Paul. Really enjoyed living in Saudi Arabia, Jim. That's interesting. How long were you there for, and what were you doing in Saudi? I know they're really looking for people at the moment, and there were opportunities for me to, when I was kind of like leaving New Zealand in 2009, when I took a UK job, part of me was kind of like, should I go to the Middle East and kind of work there for a while? Could be an interesting experience, but then it never came about. Oh, a tot, yes, American expression for a small child. No, it's okay. The English use that as well, just because I didn't understand it in the context. Okay, so next one for me is Singapore. Now, Singapore, interesting place for me. It is this kind of like nexus of many countries in sort of like Southeast Asia. It's right on the tip of the peninsula, with Malaysia and crossing over with Indonesia as well, just across the water. Um, Kind of a bit of an authoritarian state. Don't really like the way that they treat kind of like hostile migrant workers. That's a bit of an issue, and it's really hard to get kind of like work permits there as well. But nevertheless, an interesting place. Well set up in terms of like infrastructure and being able to get around, getting from A to B. I've never had any trouble kind of like using Changi Airport, getting on public transport and moving around. And accommodation, I've only really stayed over on a couple of stopovers, but I've had a few like days there in Singapore. It's intriguing to me. For me, I'm kind of like curious to explore that a little bit more. So again, it's kind of on my list of like Singapore. I find like a really interesting city historically and culturally. There are a few things about it that kind of disturb me a little bit, but I still think nevertheless it would be an interesting place to be for a little while, and maybe even to dig a little bit deeper into that. And maybe it would be really off-putting once I'd been there for a while. But I also think, it has, a lot of the modern setup and infrastructure where if you wanted to kind of like have a part-time digital nomad lifestyle, and you're moving from A to B, really interesting having a chat with a guy on my channel. And he was saying that, he was spending like part of the year in Argentina and part of the year in Japan. And so long as he had core working hours overlapping with Rome, which is where he was based, he could do that for like a month to 3 months in a year. And that's what he had been doing and was planning on doing again next year. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of people, and I think here in New Zealand, I've seen stories recently about people who are not necessarily wanting to, give it all up. They want to kind of keep their core job, but they're trying to manipulate their core job so that they could do some of that, not just remote working in New Zealand, but remote working elsewhere as well. So I think people are really trying to kind of like push the boundaries of what remote working looks like now into this kind of like part-time digital nomad lifestyle, for want of a better term. So it is really interesting to me. And I think that I probably fit into that. If I think about my last trip to Japan in August last year, it was all work. And I was there for kind of like 12 days. That was a part-time digital nomad lifestyle for me. The London trip, that was all family. I wasn't really doing any work there. I did like one afternoon of work when I was there, and that was really related to the Japan stuff I was doing. So yeah, I can see myself doing that when I go back to Japan in February next year. That will be a part-time digital nomad lifestyle kind of trip for me. I'll be there for I think 12 days again. So yeah, it's I think it's something that's kind of like growing, and people are looking and exploring this. Jim lived in Saudi Arabia for 6 months during Desert Storm. Oh man, okay, yeah, would have been an interesting time. Were you in the services then? Also worked in Bahrain. Oh yeah, no expectorating in Singapore. Yeah, no chewing gum. Yeah, there's all kinds of like rules around what you can and can't do in public, including kind of like expressing your sexuality. If that's something that you're concerned about, then yeah, there are some places in the world where you definitely are not going to feel comfortable or being or working or living at all. Yeah. Okay, next, let's talk about Japan. Okay, so I'm biased here. I absolutely love Japan. I was lucky enough to have gone there in 2007. And then again in 2009, I had a fellowship in the National Institutes for Mental Health there. And I was there for just over a month. That trip in 2007, I was there as part of a government program working with colleagues from Denmark, Belgium, and Japan, as well as our New Zealand contingent that were there. It was just fantastic. Really good way to meet Japanese people as well. I think that's also really important. If you are going to go to Japan or considering Japan, with the language being so different, and unless you have Japanese as a language, it's easy to feel lonely. And so having some kind of connection, even if it's an expat community or you're hooking up, maybe you run, maybe you can join like a group run when you get to Tokyo or Osaka or wherever it is that you're going to go. Have a way of making that social connection makes it so much more insightful in terms of being able to be in that place as somebody who can be have some other relationship than just being a tourist or just kind of like viewing as an outsider, even if it's just a smidgen, a tiny bit. Um, a peripatetic lifestyle is fascinating. Now that I'm OAP on a remote island, a static lifestyle becomes a bit dull. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess there are a few people who perhaps are in that kind of like stage of life who are perhaps being a bit more adventurous. They're more mobile and more healthy than perhaps previous generations at that stage of life. So, these opportunities then start to open themselves up, even if it's within the same country, right? You can spend some time in a different place for a different kind of experience with this kind of like part-time lifestyle. I know many people in their 60s and 70s who do that in New Zealand. They say, hey, I'm going to go here for a week, and hey, I'm going to go there for a week. Maybe I've got a bit of work here, or maybe I want to do this project here. I'm making a podcast, or I'm writing my memoir, or I'm interested in gardening, and I'm going to go and look at this stuff in this place and see if I can transplant any of that into my own garden. So yeah, it's interesting. I think people have many different motivations, not necessarily about work, but wanting to experience for an extended period of time, not just as a tourist, but actually somebody who wants a little bit of a deeper cultural engagement as well. So yeah, Tokyo is the biggest metropolis on the planet. It can feel like that at times, but it can also be extremely livable, I think. Food is cheap, actually. If you're not eating in kind of like headline, like big restaurants, food is, I think, really affordable. I wouldn't say necessarily cheap. It's hard to get fruit and vegetables and things like that. They're expensive. But if you're eating out in like, ramen restaurants or sushi places or other places like that, I think you can eat inexpensively and well. I think many people in Tokyo, particularly, apartments in Tokyo, a lot of them these days are kind of like come without real full kitchens at all. You've got some areas to kind of like maybe put something together, a small amount, or to reheat food. But many people, I think, live a lifestyle that is mainly outside of their homes. So that's really interesting to me. But on the downside, the level of working poor in Japan is really high. There's a lot of people who are kind of like making ends meet and just about getting by. And so I think that's kind of like a context that you have to be aware of when you are in places like Tokyo, for example. But Tokyo, I love. I could definitely see myself working and living there for a while and wanting to engage more deeply culturally. The other place in Japan, which I think is like really interesting to explore for me, like I've kind of like been from north to south, haven't made it quite as far down as kind of Fukuoka or Nagasaki, but I did make it up to Hokkaido, and I really quite loved Sapporo. Sapporo is kind of like a city of about 1 million people. Hokkaido itself is the most northern island of Japan, in a country of, I don't know, about 140 million people now, something like that. It is only has about 5% of the population there, or 15. Anyway, it's a small amount. So there's a lot of open space there as well. Now, it does get very snowy. It does get very cold. And that's what I was there in just kind of autumn. And I got caught in a blizzard there just when the H1N1 kind of like broke out around the planet in 2009. And I had to get back to New Zealand quite quickly because I saw my boss being translated on Japanese TV. And I thought, hey, it's a bit odd. Why is Japanese TV showing my boss being translated? So something must have happened. So I got on the internet in this kind of like ryokan in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a blizzard. I was the only person staying in this place, and found out what was going on. Eventually, once my broken Japanese, I communicated with the owner what I needed to do. So yes, you could still communicate. There was still internet that was working. This is back in 2009. I think Japan is an incredible place if you wanted to experiment with a part-time digital nomad lifestyle and a culture which is really amenable to foreigners coming along and giving what they can in terms of being able to kind of like perhaps make an effort in Japanese, but also understand. You come away richer, I think, if you're willing to put yourself out there from a visit to Japan, even if you were just visiting as a tourist. I think you get what you put in. I love the place. So yes, that's Tokyo, and that's Sapporo. Jim, Almost all my teachers here were Japanese. When I actually went there, the place felt familiar. Yeah, I imagine I hear that in Oahu, um, and in Hawaii more generally. I can't even imagine a Japan without large numbers of humans in it. I've got to go there one day. Yes, you do, Jim. You do have to go there one day. I think I have a suspicion that you'd really like it. Um, okay, let's move closer to home. I'm just looking, probably go for about another 10 minutes here. Most people are probably going to watch this on replay, but Jim, I'd be curious about whether you've been to Australia. Now, I've been to many places in Australia. I've been to every state in Australia and territory apart from Tasmania. I really need to do that one day. I'd love to go to Hobart and Launceston and have a look around. People tell me it's quite similar to New Zealand. Maybe that's what's kind of like put it down the list a little bit because I already live here, but it would be an interesting experience. But let's talk about Australia. So Australia is one of those places, a bit like London for me, is that I love visiting. I don't know if I could live there. Sydney is a very glam city. You've got the Opera House, you've got the bridge, you've got the lifestyle. It's quite expensive. That's the kind of like the overlay of Sydney, which is the capital of New South Wales. It's not the capital city. Canberra is the capital city, which I've never been to. It's kind of like in the middle of nowhere, and it was a compromise when Sydney and Melbourne were both wanting and vying for capital city status. They actually built a new one to stop the argument, I suspect, to a large extent. So, yes, Sydney, I like visiting. I don't know if I could live there. Melbourne, on the other hand, I could see myself living there. It's a more gritty city, I think. It's less kind of like glam, but it does have things like the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which is like a huge, massive cricket ground where lots and lots of games happen. Tens of thousands of people go there and watch cricket. Cricket is a big thing in Melbourne and for Victoria, which is the state as well. So I would love to be there just for that. But I think Melbourne has more of a kind of like a coffee culture, more of a gritty kind of like feel to it. Feels like it probably fits me better as a person than Sydney does. So for me, if I was going to live anywhere, it would be Melbourne. Now, Melbourne also has an extensive tram system, has extensive industry. It's easy to get there from here, but it is still quite expensive considering the distance of flight. It's probably about 3.5 hours, 4 hours if the wind's not playing nice, to get from Wellington to Melbourne. On the other side of Australia, we're going to talk about Perth. Perth is like, okay, I wouldn't ever consider living there. It's from my visit, but that was back in 2003. But where I would consider, tiny bit of me would consider, is Darwin. Now, I ended up in Darwin at the end of that trip where I went 2 months overland from Western Australia, from Perth, took a bus all the way up, getting on and off, up to Darwin at the top of the Northern Territory. I actually loved it. And if it wasn't for the horrible, horrible humidity, I could see myself being there for a little while, but it's also incredibly difficult and expensive to get to. So to go to Darwin, I don't think you'd be working a part-time digital nomad lifestyle. I think you'd probably be in the adventure industry, or possibly also in the oil or gas industry. I think they have some kind of interests around there as well. But it is a really, really interesting place. It's an incredibly beautiful place with Kakadu National Park, very close by, which I was lucky enough to go and visit. So Darwin, I think, and it was surprisingly multicultural and really gay friendly as well. Now, I'm straight, but I'm all for places that are kind of like really gay friendly. I find them really interesting and vibrant places to be. I love the acceptance of places like that, and I think that it extends out to other kinds of acceptance too. So I think for me, if I find a place is gay friendly, it's kind of like a good signal in my barometer of it being an accepting place to be. So I actually loved and was very surprised about that in Darwin, and so it made me curious. So I've only ever been there once, but it is somewhere that I would like to go again, but probably not in that humid period of the year, which I ended up visiting in. Jim, never been to New Zealand or Australia? Oh, come on, man. The loss to me. Yes, is incalculable considering my love for astronomy. Yeah, down here, I'm lucky. Just down the coast here is like an incredible dark sky environment. We see the big stripe of the Milky Way when it's a clear night. This is not a good time of year for that. This is a pretty, we have like a first spring, and then we have a second spring, and in the middle we have something that I can't say on YouTube. Yeah, you can look it up. Or DM me or something. I'll tell you what it's called. Look it up. But yeah, there's this period of like really nasty, not very nice weather and very windy as well. And that lasts for most of the spring until kind of like the really when you get right into summer, maybe the second week in December. Okay, so we talked about Darwin, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. Brisbane is kind of like the gateway to Queensland, and I actually quite like it. I have friends who live in Brisbane. I have relatives who live just south of Brisbane called the Gold Coast, where I love to spend a bit more time visiting them, if we can make that work with family and finances and all the rest of it. So yeah, I could possibly see myself basing myself in Brisbane for a while. Again, multicultural, pretty friendly city, and I think is somewhere where I could see myself setting myself up for a small period of time. Again, don't know if I would live there, but definitely could see myself kind of setting up for a little while. And then we come to New Zealand, just to finish off in the last few minutes. I'll have been on for an hour. So New Zealand, I first started off in a place called New Plymouth. I had been delaying coming to New Zealand for a while. I'd been on the books of this kind of job agency, and they kept sending me jobs, and they didn't fit my requirement as to what I wanted out of New Zealand. But then I figured that I was probably being a bit over stringent, and the perfect job was probably never going to come up, and I would just have to go. So I ended up taking a job in New Plymouth, which is kind of okay. For many different reasons, really didn't work out for me, and I was feeling quite homesick. So I went back to the UK for a while after about 8 months, went back for about 3 weeks, and I figured out that it was okay for me to fail. You know, when you give up, and even though I was probably not thinking about going forever at that point, but I kind of like put my flat on hold, I'd rented it out, I'd given up my job, I'd said goodbye to all my friends and family. Going back kind of felt like going back with my tail between my legs, like I'd been a failure or something. But once I figured out that, hey, you know, this happens, right? You know, people experiment with their lives. Life is not in a straight line, and it doesn't always work out how you want it to. Once I figured that out and I went back to New Zealand, I figured out that, hey, maybe New Plymouth is not a good fit for me. Let's figure out what is a good fit for me. And where I did end up and where I wanted to go intentionally was Wellington. Wellington is the capital city of New Zealand. There's a lot of people who are, you know, it's the most highly educated city in New Zealand. Some people would say it's a bad thing. I think it's an absolutely brilliant thing. And I love the multicultural aspect of it. It's not as multicultural as Auckland. I will say that. Now, I would never live in Auckland just because transport difficulties are so crazy. I just don't want my life to be about commuting. In Wellington, it can be a little bit crazy at times just because of how the streets are set up. There are some really horrible choke points, and it's really hard to get in and out of the city. But being on this side of the city, I only have to deal with that if I want to get out to the north of the North Island. If I'm kind of like staying within the city, I kind of stay within my half of the city, and everything kind of works out okay. But I wanted to come here to Wellington, and I've loved it. And I think it's a great place to come and set up as a part-time digital nomad. It is a really easy city to get around. It's a really easy city to come and get set up in. It's a little bit difficult to find accommodation, short-term accommodation, but it's not impossible. And I think that you do have excellent connections to the rest of New Zealand. If you were kind of like trying to live a lifestyle where you're kind of working for a while and then going out to visit places for a while, the airline network is really good. The one poor thing that I would say about New Zealand is that other than planes, it's really hard to get around. You have to drive. The road network is nothing like you may experience in other countries. They're really small single roads that are like 100 kilometers an hour, and they're really windy. And so what looks like a short distance from A to B, kilometer wise, actually takes quite a long time because the roads are actually quite tricky and you have to be really careful. The accident rate in New Zealand is really high compared to other countries of a similar size. So you do have to bear that in mind, is that if you want to get from A to B, you're either taking really slow coaches that don't take don't run that often. We don't have an intercity train network as such. We have like a tourist train that runs between Auckland and Wellington at the top of the North Island to the bottom of the North Island once a day, once a day. And we have some cities have local or regional kind of like mini train systems that don't connect up with each other. So that's the real downside, I'd say. You'd have to fly everywhere, and that's got pros and cons to it, absolutely, in these modern times. So yeah, I love being here in New Zealand. I think it's an ideal place to kind of experiment, but it is a long way from everywhere else as well. So if it is on your bucket list, I would say spend a bit of extra time. If you have some work to do whilst you're out here, you can do that here quite easily. You can get yourself set up. But most of all, come visit. It's a fantastic place to come visit. And now with 29 weekly flights between Los Angeles and Auckland, it's going to be pretty easy to get here if you are in America or traveling through America on American, Delta, United, Qantas, or Air New Zealand. Right, I'm going to stop there. I've been on for just over an hour. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're watching this on replay, please like, subscribe, come back. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about kind of like my kit that I take with me when I'm traveling, both for enjoying my travel and capturing that and sharing that, but also if I've got some work to do as well, what do I take with me so it doesn't weigh me down, so that I can travel light and experience adventures in that lightweight way. All right, thanks very much. Really, really good to see you, Jim, and Paul as well. You missed the long drives on winding roads. Did a lot of that in Germany and the UK. That's just sport for me. Commuting for work is an entirely different thing. Another thing entirely. Jim, you should come to New Zealand, man. I think you really, really enjoy it because there are some amazing scenic drives, particularly on South Island, which I think you'd really enjoy. Hi, Dave. I'm an Aussie and once took a job in Germany for a particular project. I got 4 months work out of it over there and absolutely loved it. I was lucky enough to be able to travel to countries nearby too. Yeah, that is the great thing about being based in Europe, is that you've got so many options around where it is that you can go. Hey, look, one place which I forgot to mention, I will add this, right? I said I was going to go, but I can't leave without mentioning this. I love Slovenia. Slovenia was, I was based in Bled. Okay, so I went for a little holiday, but I ended up meeting a whole load of people, ended up like filming a little bit whilst I was there as well. In Bled in Slovenia in the mountains. And it was the Julian Alps, that's the region. And it was fantastic. In fact, I found out that I got the job that I moved to New Zealand for whilst I was on holiday there. So we went out for a celebration that night. I ended up meeting a New Zealand family who connected me up with some people in New Zealand when I got here. Amazing. But then I ended up talking and chatting with this tour guide and then this waitress. And the waitress said, hey, I need to go back to Ljubljana. I'll give you a lift back there if you come with me to my university, because I need to ask for an extension and I feel a little bit scared and I just need a little bit of moral support. So I was like, sure, I'll go with you. And so we did that. And then I ended up staying in Ljubljana, which is like a lovely capital city. In this kind of Yugoslav country. Slovenia is fantastic. And if you go out into the countryside, the kind of like the rolling hills and the mountains very much reminded me of the landscape that you see in South Island in New Zealand as well. So I think there are actually quite a lot of similarities in terms of countryside, but also the style and the interaction of the people as well. I really, really loved it there. Highly recommend it. If I was back in Europe, that could possibly be a place for me that I would visit for short periods of time, maybe take a little bit of a work with me as well. Yeah, Dave, on weekends. Exactly. It would be really cool to go and visit places like this again if I ever find myself in Europe again. All right, cheers, everyone. I'm going to head off there. Lovely to see you all and hopefully catch you on chat and on the channel soon. That is all.